So welcome everyone to Creativity in Crisis, a show where we explore creativity from many different perspectives. The name Creativity in Crisis is kind of a play of words, which raises the question, is creativity in crisis in educational settings? And how can creativity thrive in states of uncertainty and crisis? This episode, we are going to be focusing on current understandings of creativity. We're thrilled to have two guests joining us both from the University of Kansas. Is that correct? Yeah, so this is a UK panel. I'm the only one not representing the University of Kansas on this particular episode at the Arizona State University. So why don't we have our guests introduce themselves, tell a little bit about yourself, your current role, kind of what your interests are in creativity, and then we're going to dive into the topic. So who would like to start?
I'm Distinguished Professor of Counseling Psychology at the University of Kansas. And since 2006, I've run a laboratory, a research through service laboratory that specifically addresses the career counseling, the social emotional needs of creative students. And we also train psychologists and counselors who are going to work in the future with creative people, for instance, at art institutes in Silicon Valley, for Grammy Foundation and organizations like that.
Thank you, Barb, and welcome. Haiying?
Hi, everyone. I am Haiying Long. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at KU. Like Ron said, I'm the colleague of Barb and Yong. My research interest focuses on creativity in education, broadly and narrowly in STEM education, and creativity assessment.
So basically, Ron, I think Barb and Haiying's internet may be not the fastest. So I hope the audience will understand and tolerate us. And
Yes.
The reasons I want them to be on this show, Ron, is that at Kansas, they have organized a group called Creativity Assessment. It's quite a large group. They've been discussing creativity assessment for education. A big issue we face is about what is creativity, how is understood, and can education help or not help? So I think that's the issues we're going to talk about. And both Barb and Haiying have been in the research field for creativity for a long time. They've been reviewing journals and articles. So this is a great moment to chat about that. Go ahead, Ron.
Yes, absolutely. So welcome both of you. We're excited to get started in this conversation. So what we typically do is Yong will post a question or a few questions actually on the topic, and we get some responses non-scientifically from social media, but it serves as kind of a stimulus for us to kind of have the conversation. So I'm going to share with you the screen here. Our first question is really about, is creativity well-defined? Respondents, we didn't get a lot of responses, but out of the 10 responses, we have this kind of dichotomous split that, you know, the majority say no, it is not well-defined, and slightly less than half say yes, it is well-defined. So why don't we go ahead and weigh into this conversation? What do you think of this response? Haiying or Barb, whoever would like to speak first?
I think, that is pretty much standard maybe for a lot of people if they're not in the field, maybe, or, if they're not keeping track of what's going on in creativity research, there are a lot of issues with the definition of creativity. Maybe that's why they think creativity is not well-defined. Of course, this depends on how we define well-defined. But my own understanding of creativity research is that during the past decade, we definitely made a lot of progress in understanding the definition of creativity, and we developed a lot of theories and all kinds of new definitions about creativity. Ron, your article with James is one of the examples. That the 4C is one of the biggest contributions to the definition of creativity. and your collaboration with Ronco and others about the 6P, 4Ps. That's another new understanding or contribution to the definition of creativity. So I think, definitely we are making a lot of progress in terms of how to define creativity, but that does not mean we don't have more work to do.
The field always looks more chaotic to the outside observer. But I think that the last decade especially has been a time of meta-analyses where people are crunching together lots of studies. It's also been a time when there's been some excellent comprehensive reviews, and there's been some agreement around some basic themes. And I think that most of us agree that that a creative product is one that is original, that is novel, and that has usefulness. I mean, those themes come up over and over again. And then if you work backwards from that to person, the capacity for originality, the capacity to come up with novel ideas, and to be original, to have the kind of flexibility to be able to think of many ideas, but also almost everybody now agrees that there has to be the capacity to elaborate upon those ideas and follow through to some degree, although that might be a product of maturity as well as domain expertise. So I know that was a complicated answer, but basically it's yes.
Ron, I was just wondering if you can you can talk about your 4 C's about creativity. That's something I think it's been known, but not widely known. So you want to share that about your definition?
I will. I'll share it briefly. And I also want to share, I would say, again, I want to kind of pick up on something Haiying brought up earlier. It really depends on, what do we mean by well-defined? And I would say there's 2 ways to respond to this question, at least from my vantage point as a creativity researcher and editor of the Journal of Creative Behavior. So on the one hand, I agree that we have, as a field, some general consensus around the definitional criteria that Barb brought up, right? That it's some kind of creativity is typically defined as some kind of blend of originality and meaningfulness or usefulness, task appropriateness, as defined within a particular social cultural context. On the other hand, there is still, and I think this is a healthy sign for the field, active debate about, okay, that's the standard definition. Are there other features of that definition? And some people have been starting to think about this a little bit differently, like Giovanni Carrazzo, one of my collaborators, has talked about dynamic conceptions of this. So even though you might define it this way, creativity by nature is inconclusive. So over time, it may never, something that was defined as creative may no longer be viewed as creative. And in fact, James Kaufman and I are working on this kind of temporal definition of creativity that it looks at the past, present, and future with respect to that definition. And also, one of my colleagues, Vlad Glavinau, and I just recently had a paper accepted in the Creativity Research Journal that we're calling the non-standard definition of creativity, where we're kind of thinking about this in a much more dynamic way and talking about the creative experience, not the creative process, which often leads to a product, but the creative experience. What are the markers of a creative experience? And again, these are very fluid. They're very multi-perspectival. They don't come to necessarily a consensus. And we're even raising questions about one of the common ways to assess creativity is get experts to have a consensus on whether something's creative or not. And we're raising the question, well, perhaps another form of creativity that's very provocative would be something that almost nobody could agree on, that maintains difference, right? There's not a consensus around it. So I think there's these healthy kind of debates thinking about, okay, yes, there are ways of defining it and operationalizing it for research, but there are other ways of thinking about creative phenomena that are less settled, less static, less fixed, much more dynamic, much more inconclusive, and much more variable across time, space, people, context. So that brings me to the 4C model, and I'll try to do this super quickly. So traditionally, when people have talked about in the field about creativity, early on, a lot of the work focused on creative greatness, eminence, like the legends of creativity. And another portion was then talking about everyday creativity, right? So there was this kind of split between what people call big C creativity and little c creativity. So big C is like this legendary creativity that's kind of out of the hands of the creator. It's kind of bestowed upon creators that have stood the test of time. So, you know, you always hear like Einstein and all these different folks across different domains and even within domains. And then there's everyday creativity where it's people doing things that are novel and meaningful in their context. And so what James and I were talking about in this 4C, in our 4C work, is that kind of dichotomous split is just a little bit too crude. It's not nuanced enough to capture what about creative experiences no one else recognizes as creative, like a child learning something, or even an expert having an idea pop into their head that's novel and meaningful to them only. That's part of the learning process. And so some of the earliest researchers like Guilford talked about, we will never fully understand the phenomenon of learning unless we understand the role creativity plays in learning. And he argued that creativity or learning is a creative act. And so mini C, that's like the first C, are these subjective, personally meaningful experiences, interpretations that are novel and personally meaningful to the person themselves and perhaps nobody else, which can rise to little c recognition where other people see like, oh, wow, like in a classroom, that's a unique way of solving that math problem. It solves the problem, but I never thought of approaching it in that particular way. So there's this kind of link between little c and mini c, and the link changes in that mini c is subjective and everything beyond that becomes this more kind of not necessarily objective judgment, but judgment by others, by an audience who says there's something new and meaningful. So you can see that even a kid might have something that they themselves don't see as creative, or an adult might have, you know, make a dinner that they don't see as necessarily creative, but everyone that's eating it says, wow, that was an interesting blend of ingredients to arrive at that. And then there's something called Pro-C, which we would argue is professional level creative contributions. So scientists that are making scientific contributions, like the vaccine that's being developed for COVID, all these different things that are happening that require a great deal of expertise, domain expertise and experience. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a well-defined domain. It could be anybody who's doing something that's recognized by others in a domain as a professional level of creativity. So an expert chef, an expert dancer, an expert scientist. That hasn't, you know, it hasn't had the time to determine whether that's radically changed the field. That leads to big C, which is legendary and much more rare and infrequent. So in a nutshell, that's 4 C's, but I don't want to go too much deeper into that, but hopefully you see the trajectory.
Ron, I think this goes to Haiying and Barb, because you and I had talked a lot about creativity is the outcome of creative potentials, creative desires, creative experiences. So in education, we are not talking about creativity, really. Rather, we try to cultivate students' creative potentials or creative abilities, the ability to create something. So I was just wondering, Haiying, Barb, and Ron, what kind of things, you know, in your research, especially Barb, you've been doing student profiles for a long time. You're trying to identify those who have great creative, you know, potentials. You know, how do you do that, Barb?
Use a trait complex approach. And that is, we started originally by reviewing the biographies of eminent men and women, 50-50, as well as eminent people across many cultures. And we looked at particular domains. But what made our research different is that we looked for what they were like in their biographies at 16 years old. And creative people at 16 years old are not like creative people at the peak of their creativity or when they're fulfilling, you know, their goals. Instead, we found trait complexes that kind of showed what young people were like as they just begin to gather their domain expertise. And it's always nearly a combination of abilities, personality, which is very important in my research. It had to be, because that was the one common denominator across the domains was openness to experience. And then the other aspect, the other part of our trait complex is privilege. And that's across 10 different dimensions of privilege, because we recognize that the development of potential, of creative potential, is not going to develop if a person occupies a position in society of such low privilege that they don't even have access to the social and cultural capital that they're going to need. So using that trait complex approach, we validated the profiles. When we did our analyses, we found out that the domains were not like we thought they were going to be. They looked a little bit like Zorana Pringle's work. They looked a little bit like that, but we had a much higher group of people in an interpersonal creativity cluster. So we've kept that cluster because these are young people who do creative social things. So that's how we do the work. And because we've seen so many, 10 students every Friday, and we are able to be with them for 8 hours of interviews, recorded interviews. We give them so many assessments. That's an enormous amount of data that helps us to understand that particular developmental stage of kids who probably had the potential to be Pro or Big C.
You know, that's I watched that's so much time, takes so much effort. Now, if we were going to move this to measure creativity or creative potentials of everybody in education, what could we do? Mm-hmm. So let me get to Haiying and Ron. So this is today I'm serving the role of moderator. You guys are all experts. So let me just ask you, how do we do that? If it's understood, how do you measure the creative potentials of students, everybody? That's assuming that in schools. How would that be possible? Haiying?
You throw a difficult question to me. Yeah. I definitely think, that's a very good question to think about. And, in terms, I remember the first episode you had is the large scale creativity assessment. That could be related because that's, what OECD and PISA are doing in the world. A good way is really a tough question. I would say in the past, usually people just use tests like TTCT in CPS if we want to focus on personality. We also, probably want to use a easier way or more manageable way of assessing creativity, like questionnaires or surveys. Of course, some people also use products. There are issues with the products. Products are definitely good with all the respects. But the problem is that you need a lot of readers to read the products. Then that is very time consuming. So I guess, the direction, I think, if we really want to identify or, assess everybody's creativity in a large scale, we probably want to use different ways of doing that. Definitely Barb's way of profiling is a good approach of doing that. Except again, and there are so many tests you have already done, but can we do that in large scale? I remember James mentioned, of course, if Bill Gates give us like $5 billion to do this, maybe that is feasible. But definitely if we understand the importance of creativity and want to do that at the school or district level, there should be some way of doing that. Like, we spend so much money on SAT and ACT preparation. We spend so much money on IT tests and other things. So I think, the point I want to say is the first thing we want to make sure that everybody thinks creativity is very important and can bring that to a very important place. Then let's talk about the large scale assessment and do all these things. But going back to my point, I think, if we want to assess creativity in a better way, I would suggest using multiple ways of doing that. And definitely goes back to Ron's I think, the mini-C and unstandard definition of creativity have great potential of doing that. But, transfer that into assessment, I guess this is probably something we need a little bit of time to explore, or maybe Ron has already had the answer.
So I think we need to move on to the next question, but the conclusion right now is that, in my view, there are no creative assessments that can be applied in education as we've known of tests of literacy and numeracy. And so, Ron, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, so I would say I take a little bit of a different approach here. I would say it's not really about measuring potential, because I think there's also agreement in the field that all humans have creative potential. I mean, it's not something that it's something that we all have, right? It's a survival instinct and so on. So the idea here is, okay, if given that all people have creative potential, what do we then do in these spaces, these educational spaces? So I think the next step would be, okay, if all people have creative potential, is that enough to be a creative, to perform creatively, to make creative achievements, to engage in creative activities? And there seems to be a pretty clear answer, no. For some of the reasons that Barb brought up, most kids don't get the opportunity to do that in this place called school. And so I would say we can never fully understand creative potential unless we start understanding the role that uncertainty plays in creative thought and action. Uncertainty is the stimulant to think and act in new ways. If you already know how to get from A to Z, if the problem's already well defined and there's a clear procedure for getting to the solution, and the solution's already known, which is what school is predominantly about, unfortunately, then it engineers out, it plans out opportunities for different pathways of getting to correct answers, or the possibility of kids coming up with their own problems to solve, their own ways to solve them, and their own meaningful ways to represent them. So it really is about creating opportunities and experiences where we bring in what I call structured uncertainty, uncertainty that has support from teachers and others, right? That has kind of clear guidelines, but allows kids to come up with their own ways of identifying problems worth solving to them in their communities, and giving them opportunities and supports necessary to try to address those in new and meaningful ways. That's creative. Now, my colleague in Poland, Maciek Karwowski, and I have done a series of studies where we talk about kind of creative behavior as agentic behavior. So in other words, we've looked at indicators of creative potential, like the Torrance test of creativity, alternate use tasks, all these different things that assess kind of creative potential. And if you look at the relationship between creative achievement and activity, it's highly variable and almost non-existent. So what comes in between there? What we have theoretically kind of outlined and have started to empirically demonstrate is, and it's kind of what Haiying brought up, people need to value being creative. They need to have confidence in their ability to be creative. And in a most recent study, they also have to be willing to take risks. So regardless of how much potential anyone has, and everyone has creative potential, unless they have confidence in their ability to do something new and different, value doing that, and are willing to take the risk, and there are risks in doing that, then it's unlikely that it's going to lead to any kind of creative activity or creative achievement. So how do you get confidence? How do you develop risk-taking? How do you develop values? You have to build that into the curriculum by removing this over-planned, over-structured, overwrought design that kids have to kind of work through, where they have almost zero opportunity, at least in kind of the classroom space, to actually do those things, to build confidence by seeing like, oh, wow, I didn't know what to even think about as a problem. But in thinking through it with my colleagues and peers, we identified something that really could improve our community or our school or beyond. And then give them the time and resources and opportunities to do that. Otherwise, it becomes this highly privileged space. And it's kind of what our volume, Yong, is talking about, democratizing creative educational experiences. That's the only way we can cultivate these features that I would argue lead to actual creative achievement and activity, regardless if it's at the kind of pro-C level, just at the everyday level where we realize our creative potential. I know we're getting to the next prompt here.
You gotta go next one.
Let's do it.
Time
Let's
goes
do
by
it.
very fast.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let me bring us to our next prompt. And can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so our first question is, was talking about, is it defined clearly, and now is it well understood? So it's kind of the follow-up. And so even though it was somewhat split on the definitional component of it, the meaning of it, now this understanding piece is pretty clear that overwhelmingly folks say it's not well understood. And there's in fact no yes, maybe. So maybe it's understood. So we get nobody, at least out of this teeny tiny little sample of 10 respondents.
Well, there's a very powerful sample.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a very powerful people who follow me on Twitter, and then they fill this out. There's a really precious, very precious people. I'm actually pretty sure most of the people who filled this out have thought about this issue. Because
yeah, for sure.
They couldn't do it. So my issue is here. So when we talk, there's a lot of talk about creativity. I think today everybody talks about it. Everybody, and then if you look at the 4 C's, creativity is big, and all these things. So I pose that question. Is really trying to get to say, do you think in general everybody talking about this understood? And apparently it is not well understood. So I think it is useful, again, for the three of you as creative researchers, to say, if we want to cultivate creativity and measure creativity and to further support it, what do you think we need to do? What kind of understanding do we need to help the society get a better understanding of it? So I want to go with maybe Barb. You want to go start that? What do you think?
Yang Zhao and Yang Zhao knows I feel very strongly about this, and that I don't believe that, especially in education, that we understand creativity very well. And there's a reason for that. And that's that I think we have to remember, whenever we just say everybody's creative, well, everybody has the potential for everyday creativity. Does everybody have the potential for eminent creativity? No, because all of the traits and all the capacities that are associated with that kind of creativity are distributed on a normal curve. And the other thing that we have to, and so of course there's just going to be a small number of people that have that potential, and in addition they have to have the environments that encourage it. So yeah, when it's that hard for people to get through school and be understood as creative people, we can't say creativity is understood, because they're not. But I think we have to remember that although every kid has creative potential, that we come into the world with some very different temperaments. And that's for a good reason. I mean, humans would never have survived if we were all alike. And we certainly wouldn't have survived if every small indigenous wandering group of foragers were all highly creative. Can you even imagine what that would be like? In every human group, you need a few highly creative people. You need a few super conscientious people who aren't creative very much at all, but are willing to allow the creative people to live and maybe even appreciate what they do. And then you need a lot of people who have other skills, other social skills, and that sort of thing. So I think we have to be careful that we don't do what the people in intelligence did and say, there's no such thing as intelligence. Everybody's smart, so everybody gets the same education. I think we need to make sure that we tailor the creativity education that we do to the temperaments of kids. There are going to be kids we do really cool creative activities with, and they're going to hate it because they're super conscientious people who don't like novelty. they don't like unpredictable situations. And so when we give them risk-taking activities, they will freak out and hate it just as much as those of us who are klutzes hate physical education. So I think that we have to be careful and make sure that we tailor our creativity education to the kids, making sure that it's okay to teach some kids to just appreciate creativity and to see the things they're doing that are creative.
So
Just
Barbara, I have a question. So are you thinking there's one type of creativity and only a small percentage of people can own a high level of creativity? So you're saying that it's one generic creativity, or can students be creative in their own way?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I think there's so many domains. There's so many ways and so many domains that have been, that have not gotten credit, like the things that we do with our hands, right? And that are done by less privileged people. So they're, considered less important. No, I think there are many kinds of creativity and they can all be encouraged. But I also think that there are different ways that people of different temperaments respond to novelty, originality, and risk-taking, so that there are some kids who don't want any new experiences and some kids who are like, well, that's cool, and are able to be opened up. And there are some kids that'll just take off with it and say, yeah, this is it, this is great. And so I have a special concern that there be something in schools for those kids who love new ideas and want to take risks and want to try out new things, because right now there's nothing for them.
But let me interrupt for a second. I think, one danger, I would argue, in this line of thinking is to assume that somehow educators can identify and predict what kids are going to have this kind of disposition or whatever. I would argue it's just all humans deal with uncertainty all the time. All humans take risks all the time. All humans do creative things all the time on various ways. Every human has creative potential. I think realizing those potentialities is often, and the way that it tends to fall on a bell curve, perhaps is an artifact of the way it's measured and the opportunities that are provided. So I think it's, so think about this. I'm not saying that everybody can be an eminent creator in every single domain, right? But we don't know. Mm-hmm. We can't prejudge and predetermine who's going to do what, right? So even prodigies sometimes don't go on to do anything. They kind of peaked, right? Early on. Right. So I think we have to be very careful. And I think the thing that we tend to do as educators and adults is predetermine the pathways. So I think what our job is less about trying to say, these kids seem to enjoy risk-taking and creative tasks, and these kids recoil. And I would say it's less about let's give those kids who seem to enjoy it those opportunities, and let's give these other kids that don't like it more compliance-based opportunities. What if we gave all kids opportunities to explore their potentialities, not worry about necessarily the full trajectory of it, because it's going to be variable and dynamic and unfixed, but give them experiences to engage with difference, to kind of realize their interests and their creative potentialities in that time when they're in this place called school, and then see how it plays out. Because Big C is out of the hands of the creator anyway. Those are who comes to be a legend or whatever is determined by connoisseurs, critics, after that creator's dead, right? So that doesn't even make sense for education. So
Ron, this is actually, I think you are changing the topic a little bit. I agree with you. Education should give everybody, but I was really interested in Barb's presupposition. It's very hard for me to agree with Barb to say, yes, there's a group of people who are extremely creative and they deserve more. Because I'm actually very interested in the idea to say, you have multiple intelligences. Generally, do we have multiple creativities in essence? If it's multiple creativities, can any individual create and live a very successfully creative life? Haiying, let me just go to you. This is an interesting debate and discussion. Haiying, yes.
You always give me the most difficult question.
Oh, no, it's not difficult. It's just more fun.
I would say, when we were talking about creativity, we seem to talk creativity in a general sense. But there's definitely the debate between, general creativity or specific creativity. For me, I would say some field, maybe you are not creative in some other fields. So I feel like, for me, it's kind of a struggle to figure out whether it's general creativity or specific creativity, or maybe it's just both. But I think some creative abilities can be transferred across different domains or tasks, but some may not. Especially if the domains are very closely related, like dance and maybe theater, they can be transferred. I don't know, I'm just making up. But if you say math and physics, they could be also closely related. But I'm not quite sure if there are definitely some people they are creative. Once they are creative in any field, they are good at math and they are very creative in dance at the same time. But maybe most people would be creative in some fields. At least my thinking right now. I'm talking about, how the creative potential of everybody and how to nurture that potential. I think, both Ron and Barb were talking about pretty much the same thing, but in different ways, I would say. But I think, my take of that question would be more like, we need to create an environment to nurture students' creativity. And I definitely think, everybody has a potential to be creative. It just depends on where you are and how others around you were doing in order to nurture that creativity at a very young age. That goes back to the creative self-efficacy issue.
I do think Barb is right, but Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to clarify, and I think we want to have productive debate here. So I think one thing, I think there's no denying when you look at the literature that only by definition, big C is going to be extremely rare. So the question is, why is that rare, right? So there's no denying that. It's not like there's going to be everyone on Earth is going to be Einstein, right? So under what are the conditions, right? So to think about becoming an expert, there's only limited resources, time, energy, opportunities, all these different things, confluences of events that kind of conspire against people maybe rising to a higher level of creative achievement in a particular domain, right? So yes, there are limited portions, but I think we have to be very careful of trying to predict those, to assume that we can somehow identify early on a trajectory when there's so much uncertainty involved in this process, and preclude opportunities for other kids to do something, right? Because they're not getting that experience, or to foreclose on a trajectory for another kid who is perhaps like a math prodigy, but by the time they get to an adult, they want to do something completely different. And the truth is, if you look at some of like John Baer's work on domain specificity, the correlations between somebody who's judged highly in one creative domain and another creative domain are almost nil, right? So the idea is, yes, because it takes domain expertise, it takes time and energy, it takes effort, it takes motivation, it takes willingness to do those kinds of things. But what I'm trying to say is, we don't know, so we should provide opportunities, and how things play out, that's how they play out. But I think what I was raising about the danger of it is that we tend to kind of predetermine these pathways, assuming that we know that these kids, because they've done well in this particular context, this particular time on these particular tasks, are somehow going to benefit more from creative experiences than all kids, is kind of the way school's set up right now with gifted ed programs and so on. Why not give all kids creative opportunities? I'm not saying that some kids don't need acceleration and depth of that and so on, but I think we don't do enough of providing those opportunities. But I want to hear Barb's kind of rebuttal to this, because we do want this kind of productive, more nuanced perspective.
All kids need the opportunities, but it depends on at what level. And I can give you a great example from one of the most creative countries in the world. A team and I went to Iceland and for one summer, we did a study of one question. Why is Iceland so creative? Why do they have more patents per capita? Why do they have more art exhibits? Why do they have more musicians? Why does 1 in 8 Icelanders publish a novel? What's up with that? We spent an entire summer interviewing people, doing testing, all kinds of surveys, everything to get the answer. And it was fascinating that Iceland, since 1991, has been doing what they call innovation education for every child beginning in kindergarten. And innovation education is an opportunity to work with materials and tools, and that includes reading and writing, to work with materials and tools in order to solve problems that are important to the kids. So that kindergartners might make recycling bins because they think they don't have any in the classroom and they want to design them. Every Icelander knows how to knit. Every Icelander knows how to use a power tool. 5-year-olds use power tools in Iceland. I was there, I saw it. My own kids do. So what you have is a country that's set up so that at the elementary level, clear through 12, kids are getting opportunities for the whole class together to solve problems that are important to them. By the time they're in what we would call middle school, it's different, but about that age, they're solving neighborhood problems. They're learning how to ask their neighbors, what are some problems we could help solve? And then they are encouraged to come up with risky solutions. And then there's some kids that by the time they're 14 or so, about the range of kids that I study, they know what they really love. And I'm not saying all of them, but there's kids who love music and want to be rock and roll stars, and they get to spend after school at the Hittehuset at the rock and roll house, and it's part of their schooling that they get to learn rock and roll. And some of the kids really get into design. If they're interested in engineering, then they're already by high school being encouraged to be doing engineering. And then they have 2 more years of high school. So they have a 6-year high school, 2 more years in which they can specialize. And what you end up with is an entire nation with people who know domain. They are started out with an interest in solving problems creatively, given tools, materials, strategies, so that you get a lot of creative adults. People who have, well, Ron, you've written about self-efficacy, creative self-efficacy. Icelanders really do. Except if you ask them if Iceland's creative, they go, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and
no,
I think that's the point. I mean, we're definitely in alignment on that. And I call those kinds of curricular experiences legacy challenges, right? So it is, the curriculum is basically 4 questions. What's the problem you want to solve? Why does it matter? What are you going to do about it? And what lasting legacy are you going to leave? What difference are you going to make in the world around you, right? And so giving kids and young people those opportunities to work in communities, develop those interests and skills, that's how we can kind of create a much broader and kind of shift, I think, that curve of what we've assessed traditionally, where all kids didn't have those opportunities. And we might see a little bit of more of a skewed curve toward more creative adults, right? More creative people, which leads us into our next question. I mean, time flies. We're almost out of time here. We have 15 minutes left, but here's our next question, and it leads right into that. So let's take a look at that. So our last question that was asked is, does creativity grow as we age? Now, you hear a lot of folks talking about, children are creative geniuses. I mean, there was even that's something that swirled around. And so thinking in the 4C model, that doesn't even make sense. But what do we think about this response? So does it grow as we age? Some say maybe. And we've also heard things about, creativity getting killed in schools and all these kinds of things, that schools kill creativity. And then we only see a small portion that says yes, and then some that says no. But the majority is this kind of ambiguity. So what are people's responses? And maybe, Haiying, we'll start with you, since Barb and I have been talking, and then we'll go.
If I answer that question, I would say maybe. Because, I I would say yes and no. Yes, because as we age, we probably have more knowledge. Then if we can have all this knowledge putting together and coming up with some new solutions or something like that, yeah, maybe we have like maybe a higher level of creativity. Or if the environment continues to support us with something we're doing every day, and then, like you guys were saying, starting as a young kid, and they were encouraged to do a lot of creative things, and they continue to do as they age, then that could happen. But on the other hand, as you age, you probably lose some part of your environment. Maybe you are one of your new ideas at a young age was discouraged by your parents, and you were like, okay, you are crazy. Then you lost that creativity. To some degree, it also depends on your perseverance, right? If you are like a persevere, if you have like a high level of perseverance, you probably want to do whatever others say, you just go do it. Then that could help as you age. But some people just easily give up, especially when you do not feel self-efficacious about your creativity abilities. So my answer is definitely depends on individual and all kinds of other dispositions and situations.
That's a hard question for me to answer. Does creativity change as we age? And I agree with Ron. If you think of it in terms of all these different kinds of creativities, then the question doesn't even make sense. I think that our creativity should change as we age, so that that we are still cultivating lots of everyday creative activities, because we know that's associated with well-being. That people who have a lot of creative activities in their life, whether it's gardening or writing in their journal or something, we know that's associated with well-being, and so that should continue all through life. Those little activities that make you feel happy. On the other hand, often in an expert field, in pro-C ways, we have to become a little less creative. We have to become a little, less expansive in our creativity when we're at the assistant and associate professor level, because it's so important that we understand the domain we're in, and that we use the tools and methods of that domain the way they're supposed to be used, so that we have a little period of life where I think we need to be a little, less expansive and more narrow in focus of learning what we need to know, gaining that knowledge, as Haiying said, what we need to know in order to be able to then maybe become creative at another level later on.
So let me add that question back to Ron. Actually, Ron, I would like you to answer this question. So in essence, from what Haiying and Barb was talking about is that, does creative grow, or can creative truly be educated? That's the real question. That, if you become so unique in what you do, and you have become so persistent in what you do, and so self-efficacious about what you do, your creativity is changed, as you guys are talking about. So if we were going to try to do education, we're measuring a generic creativity or creative potential, which may not even be measured, should not be measured. So should we measure, again, we talked about this before, Ron, should we have a generic measurement of creativity? There are thousands of creativity measures.
That's about thinking about what measures do we need as the initial question, and thinking more about the idea of, okay, so breadth and depth is one thing to think about. So we want to provide people with broad experiences across domains early on, and then through our life, right? People want to still, anytime you're learning, you're having many creative experiences. You can be dabbling and tinkering in domains like learning how to cook or learning how to become a competition barbecue chef, which is something I did at Oregon, or how to brew beer or whatever. Well, you're going deep in a domain. So if you want to contribute creatively to a well-established domain, And I agree 100%. It takes time. You have to learn the idea of think outside the box, you have to understand the contours of the box in order to think outside of it. And in order to learn how to design a new box, right? So it's not just about becoming saturated in that domain just so you kind of continue to do what's being done, but so that you can do things differently, right? So that you can create new boxes or, replace them or modify them, right? So you do need deep domain expertise to contribute in a domain. That takes time. And so it just, by virtue of time, we age over time. That's why older folks are more likely to be pro-C contributors. That said, young people can partner with established experts to launch their ideas. So they might not have the engineering expertise to develop something that they have the idea about, but if they partner with a group of engineers, they certainly can, right? And it becomes a more participatory and collaborative effort, right? So we have to think about that as well. So there are these interesting, I think, productive tensions. There are times in our life when we need to conform and go deep and go narrow, and we always want to kind of keep some breadth so that we're keeping things fresh, all with the idea that perhaps we can do things differently. And that's where imagination comes in. What currently is the case? The only way you understand the current state of a domain is to go deep and learn it. It takes time to develop expertise. Then you can start thinking about how could this or should this be different? And that's where you can start being innovative and creative and transforming those domains. And so I think we can give young people these experiences, even though they don't have the expertise. The typical approach to education is this promissory note. Learn this now, learn this now, learn this now. Someday you can do something different. I think you can do both and. Learn this now. If you have an interesting idea and we have project time, let's connect you with some outside experts who could be like an expert plumber, for example, right? That might you even have in your family. And then you can kind of take this idea and put it to the test and see, does it make a contribution right now? And then in the meantime, if you want to learn a domain deeply, that could be a trajectory. So I think we're kind of arriving at some kind of agreement here. I see some nodding their heads, but I want to hear, with the time that we have left, what are people's thoughts on this kind of trajectory? Because that's what we're talking about. What is this trajectory? What is the role of education, and how do we get there? Including you, Young.
That's what our journal is about. So maybe let's hear from Haiying and Barb first before we come to a summary. Time really flies. Just I don't know. We had fun. I hope our audience will have a great time with us. Haiying, do you want to have some concluding remarks about what we talked about, creativity?
I think creativity is teachable, is nurturable, is malleable. It depends on how we do it as a teacher, as a school, how we create that environment to nurture that kind of desire to create new things, and also how to encourage people to do that in a long time, or the so-called growth mindset. And in order to make people feel more self-efficacious about their creativity ability, and to make it not only a long-term goal but also like a long-term goal. And also, I think starting at a young age, we need to recognize the importance of creativity and how important each small experience would be in that classroom, and understand how that small things would affect what a person wants to do in the future, and take that very seriously in the classroom, and to make the long-term creativity as the goal. Of course, not everybody would be the big name in the field or the most creative persons in the world, but at least you have your own creating behaviors or creating mindset, and to have a positive consequences in your own life. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah. When I think about education, I just go back to what the young people tell us. We have a focus group at the end of the day where they get to talk about what they're anxious and depressed about, because the levels of their anxiety and depression of these kids who are profiled as creative, and we know they are because they all have original music, original art. They all, at least at the state and regional level, have these accomplishments that their teachers don't usually know anything about, especially those who have national tours with their bands and things. Okay, so you have these kids, and by anybody's assessment, you would say, yeah, they're creative. What do they need in school? What they tell us all the time is that they wish that there'd been somebody around to give them the information they needed when they needed it to do what they needed to do. Some of them are lucky to have parents who were able to fulfill that role. Some of them had a wacky aunt or uncle. They needed adults to give them, the resources they needed to do the projects they wanted to do. The other thing that they really need, though, is over and over they tell us, we just want the other kids to either leave us alone or not be always, like bullying us and tormenting us. Especially in Midwestern schools, the kids who are doing music, art, invention, science fair, all these kinds of things, they are outsiders, because what counts in America is athletic expertise. That's it. That's what really counts. Oh, and getting A's. So the ideal in the high school is the scholar athlete, somebody who's smart and does well in all courses, but is a star. So these kids just keep telling us, we just want the other kids to appreciate what we like to do. And maybe if they got a chance to do some of those things when they were younger, maybe they would. So that just tells me it's all about doing what we've been talking about, giving these kids in groups large opportunities to solve problems. And along the way, some of the kids, they just might learn to appreciate creativity. Even if they don't produce any magnificent creative thing, that's okay, as long as they allow the other kids to do their thing. So we're talking about some cultural changes that need to be made in education so that creativity itself is not seen as weakness, oddness, strangeness, something that's not cool. And
Ron, I want you to end this. You
okay.
have.
So I think what this points to is this idea that openness to experience is a big factor of creativity always, but something that we talk about more recently is this notion of openness to difference. And so what if we created these curricular experiences for all students and they realized that they could study their passions, their interests, develop confidence and competence in them, then perhaps it would become something that creativity is just part of what we do. And I think we're wasting a lot of potential in schools, right? Both of teachers and and students. And so if we gave kids more opportunity to explore, to do meaningful work, then yes, it would increase appreciation, confidence, and we would likely see more creative adults. So thank you all for joining us. I think this has been a really provocative conversation. Thank you both. It's been fun. I hope our listeners enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I love the disagreements.